Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Cross, and I wanted to provide some feedback in terms of assignment one, part two. Um, the reason for this feedback is because I know that students who are aware and have a better understanding of assignment one do a lot better when it comes to the final assignment, which will be helping you utilize the same skills that you use for part one into part two. So again, wanted to provide a little feedback in terms of how you think about assignment one, part two, and some of the additional information that I want you all to have, or to at least remind students of things to think about, because the skills of diagnosing that you're learning in assignment one, you will also be applying to the final assignment. One is the presenting case information. Please be sure that when you're writing the presenting case information, that you are only highlighting those areas or the presenting problems identified in a case that's going to help you make the diagnosis. So again, we're not looking for a full rundown of information on a client. Why is this helpful? When you are working in practice, when you're actually, when you all are complete with this program and you have your license and you're working with clients, they come in with a host of issues. For instance, a client can say, "Oh, I lost my home. My wife left me. I have substance issues. I have a history of abuse." They bring so many problems to you, so much so that as a social worker, you can be overwhelmed and not know what to do. And so you can't work on everything for many reasons. Sometimes it's out of your scope of practice. Sometimes your agency limits your role in terms of what type of services that you can provide. So even though you understand the range of issues that are impacting a client, sometimes you have to provide a more focused intervention. So the presenting problem is helping you know how to identify the key features of the problem, particularly for this purpose to make a diagnosis. But sometimes you're working in an agency, for instance, you could be working in a housing agency and mental health not be the focus. So you're doing an assessment specifically related to housing. So how do you then hone in on the specific problems in which you are to address? So please remember that when you're outlining a presenting problem for this class and for your papers, you're targeting you're identifying the problem in a targeted way. You're only focusing on those key issues or the key areas of the problem that's going to help you and justify, provide the evidence for your diagnosis. Again, do not always think about problems as listing every single problem that the client is working that a client may have, but really think critically about what are the main problems presenting and how that impacts the diagnosis. The DSM-5 diagnosis. Whenever you're asked to write the DSM-5 diagnosis, please write out the full criteria. As much information as you can about the diagnosis. This means the actual diagnosis, description of the diagnosis, and the symptoms and the full criteria. Oftentimes, there is additional information such as in criteria A, criteria B, criteria C, D, and E. Write out the full criteria. The reason why I encourage students to write out the full criteria is that there may be things in that criteria that is listed in the presenting problem that may rule out the diagnosis. So, for instance, sometimes you'll see if a client has a substance use problem or is under the influence of substances, certain diagnoses cannot be provided. There are also sometimes medical conditions that rule out diagnosis as well. So again, when you're writing out the full criteria, A, B, C, D, or E, sometimes it lets you catch um, exclusions, symptoms, criteria that you may put in the presenting problem in which you can't provide that diagnosis. This is why it's important for students to write out the full criteria. Students who wrote out the full criteria got points. Some students ask, "Oh, do I have to put the code?" You do not have to put the code, but if you do decide to list the actual code, that is the number, the number behind the diagnosis, that just lets me know that you're thorough. The code is usually used for billing purposes, FYI. Additional information necessary to make a diagnosis. This is your opportunity to convey to the professor that you understand the diagnosis and what it entails. You might find that when you're writing your presenting problem, that the client meets 3 of 5 symptoms or 4 of 5 symptoms. And here you want to write down what is the additional information that will be needed for you to make that diagnosis. That could be symptoms and or criteria. History of treatment. Think about historical treatments for that particular disorder. So if you said a client has PTSD or a client has anxiety, this section you are supposed to write in detail what is the history of treatment for that particular diagnosis. That may be a discussion that talks about how the diagnosis today is not what it used to be called in the past. So talking about that disorder in a historical context is what is needed here. So again, what you're doing in the historical treatment area is identifying what that diagnosis was in the past and what were the treatments used. That and again, the more comprehensive you are in each of these sections will determine the grade or how many points you get for each of those sections. So think thoroughly. Think about not just what type of one-to-one therapeutic or clinical intervention um, was provided to that client or a client with that diagnosis historically, but you're also looking at what are the type of medications that are used, what are type of um, um, facilities were used. Was it group therapy, the modality highly used? Were inpatient treatment, residential treatment? What was the predominant treatment modality from a historical perspective? Whenever you're talking about the strength-based assessment, this is asking you to utilize the information from part one into part two. In part one, you are expected to write a thorough assessment of client strengths. So for part two, you're just to identify what the strengths are of that client. So based on your strengths-based assessment, what were the strengths that you identified for that client? Again, not just writing out the strengths, but understanding how those strengths are going to help you deal with the diagnosis or the disorder that you identified for the client. Contemporary responses, right? What are we doing now to treat that particular disorder? So the part of the paper, the earlier part of the paper asks you to talk about the historical interventions. The contemporary responses are how do we respond to that, to people who have that disorder today, currently? And the critique of the diagnosis. This helps you do a thorough diagnostic impression for your client by thinking about what if I got this wrong? How am I going to critique the diagnosis that I provided? So if you gave a client a diagnosis of anxiety, now critique that. What are some of the things that make the client that the client doesn't meet the full criteria for that disorder? So think about presenting problem, think about symptoms, think about full criteria. And if you had to critique yourself, really question whether you got it right and what are some of the reasons why you may have had it wrong. That is what you're doing with the critique of the diagnosis. This is just a brief video to really help you understand the different components of that assignment one. Even though assignment one is done, I'm providing this particular video so that it'll help prepare you for the final assignment, which you will be utilizing the same tools from part one into part two. So you get another chance to diagnose. The difference here is that the case is provided for you and part one of the assignment will not occur. So you'll just be doing the write-up, which was part two of assignment one for your final assignment. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Look ahead at the assignment, drop into virtual office, schedule a meeting with me. Also, what I have been doing is meeting with students to hopefully give them tips on how to improve their papers in the future. So please, before you start your assignment, always start your assignments early so you can give yourself time to think about what is needed and what is expected. Also start your papers early so that if you have any questions, you can let me know. What I strongly recommend that you do is think about the assignment instructions and then begin writing the outline for your paper. So this is the headings using the assignment instructions. Also take your time and look at the rubric. The rubric shows you how you're going to get points for your paper. Then make sure that you go back to your outline and make sure that you're covering all the areas in the rubric. That's going to get you points. So you're going to develop an outline for your paper using um, the assignment instructions and the rubric. The rubric is aligned with the assignment instructions, but you always want to double check to make sure you get all your points. Then after you finish writing your paper, I would like for you to go back to your rubric and compare your final paper to the rubric and make sure you're covering all the areas that's needed to get points. As always, the earlier you start, the better students do. If you have questions, you can catch them early. And that way I'm not getting last minute emails the week the assignment's due or a couple days before the assignment is due. The earlier you start off with the assignment, the better off I find that students do. As always, I am here for you. We are actually getting very close to the end of the semester. I'm very pleased with how many of you are doing. Please understand this course is meant to help you learn how to diagnose. How do you look at presenting problems? How do you diagnose? How do you understand historic treatment for disorders, current treatment for disorders? Also, APA format is essential. It is important for many reasons. I won't use this video to discuss that, but just make sure that you get it together. I am seeing where students are improving over time. Again, I am pleased with where you are. I do understand this is a challenging course, especially if you've never diagnosed before. However, the skills that you're learning to enhance, learning about the different disorders, learning about how to diagnose are skills that are going to serve you as social work clinicians in the field. My hope is that many of you go on to get your clinical social work license, not your master's level license, but your clinical. And the information that you're learning in this course will help you and help support that. So that when you are studying for your clinical licensure, none of the information that will be presented to you will be new. Now, there are some clinical information that is listed also in your master's level exam, but on a very lower percentage than in the clinical exam. So if you're successful in this course, if you do your readings from the required textbook, which is required for your discussion boards, and it is why I require it for your discussion boards. If I know you're doing those readings, I know you'll be in a good place for your licensure. Also, please consider keeping the books for this course, particularly the DSM-5, the Kaplan book as well. That will help you with your studying for the licensure exam. And again, I hope this review is helpful for you. I'm going to try to keep these videos a lot shorter in terms of time so all students can look at it. Also, please be sure that you're watching and reviewing all the content listed, particularly the videos that I upload, because it'll help you be successful in the course. Thanks.